welcome back and thanks for joining me. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. First thing, thanks for the comments on the last video on some of those differential tricks. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the comment section. I'll try to answer what I can. Hopefully I've got valuable information for someone at least. Again, thanks for watching and throwing those comments in. This video is going to be kind of a little different. I'm going to jump around to a few different things. As you recall, I finished up the FC a few videos ago. Now, in real world, I finished that FC up 1.5 years or 2 years ago. So I've had some time to drive it, figure out what bugs are in it, and today we're going to work a couple of those bugs out of it. Well, one of the bugs I wanted to work out on this little FC truck is it likes to run hot. You can run it, but hot day, it gets pretty warm. I mean, it's hitting 220, 230 pretty easy, and it's not easy to get it to come back down. So it's got this rear-mounted radiator, which I'm not a huge fan of because then you have to use an electric fan. But I've tried the little fans as pushers, pullers. I've blocked off the engine heat coming out of the engine compartment, and it seems to just stay where it's at. So my thought is the little shroud assembly this came with is actually restricting some of the airflow, especially since a lot of these fans really don't put out that much cubic feet per minute. So my goal is I'm going to have to move the radiator around a little bit, tilt it a little bit in to get a big fan on the back to clear, and I'm going to remove that front shroud, and then we'll see what happens. So here's the first part, is getting access to it. Nothing on this truck is easy to work on. If you remember when I built this radiator support on that earlier video, I mirrored all the holes so that I could mount that radiator to the front or the back channel on that. I also used all this flexible tubing, so hopefully none of that will have to get changed. So moving the radiator forward, what that's going to do is it's going to give me clearance between the winch mount and that expanded steel to actually fit the fan in there. So the other thing I'm going to have to do once I move that radiator forward is I'll remove those spacers for the expanded steel, and then I'll probably have to trim the mount for the expanded steel off, because I really need to keep that expanded steel close to the radiator so that the fan can draw air correctly. So this is the fan shroud, and if you look at the pitch on these fans, there's very, very little. And even if they're turning fast, they cannot possibly pull that much air out. Plus, any ambient air that hits it really isn't going to hit the radiator. So I think this is going to be a good decision. Now I got to move the radiator. With the radiator moved to the forward holes, I marked the mounts for that expanded steel, taped them off so I wouldn't screw up where I cut them. Cut the ends off. And I think this will actually be a little cleaner fit than it was originally. Now that I've got these cut, I think the expanded steel will sit very, very close to the radiator without hitting it. And then I can mount the fan to the expanded metal. I personally am not a big fan of those weird zip ties that go through a radiator to mount an electric fan to. Well, first things first, I actually had a fan that I'm going to use. It's rated at about 2,100 cubic feet per minute. Now, if this fan works better, but just not quite enough, I can always get a higher CFM fan. But first things first, get it all cleaned up because it does have to look good on this thing. Next, I'll need to mount the fan to the expanded metal, and I'm just going to center it on the expanded metal. I think it'll get the biggest footprint that's possible that way on the radiator, which will give it the best chance of cooling. So once I get it all centered, we'll get some bolts and get her mounted up. And typically, like I normally do, is go overboard with hardware and things like that. I always try to use new hardware, but I think grade 8 nuts and bolts are a little overkill for holding a plastic fan to a piece of expanded steel. Use that for my ground strap. So this should be a pretty good ground strap, since this will all be clean and grounded. And yes, the blue wire is the ground. If I'm going to make it a pull, if I want the fan to go the other direction, then I would put the black wire there. How do I know that? I just hooked it up to a battery and tested it. With the fan mounted to the expanded steel, I needed to get in there, make sure it test fit okay, make sure I didn't have a clearance issue, even though I moved the radiator forward. Put it in with a couple of bolts, made sure everything was straight, made sure everything lined up correctly, and then once I have made sure everything fits right, I'll pull it out and get everything set up for final assembly. Make a couple mentions about cooling systems. There's several things you need to make a cooling system work correctly. The first thing is you got to have coolant or water flow. We're talking about water-cooled engines, obviously. But you need to have a coolant, obviously. And you have to have enough coolant, a high enough capacity to flow, cool down, go back into the engine, cycle several times without it overheating. After that, you have to have a radiator, something to disperse the heat transfer, cool down the coolant. And then the last thing, which is what I'm working on today, is airflow. I would actually take a mechanical cooling fan and a shroud over an electric any day. I think they are A, more reliable, B, I think they draw more air. But I don't have a lot of choice on this FC because the cab over, the engine, there's just not enough room for a radiator that has enough capacity. This cooling system actually holds over 5 gallons of cooling, plenty of capacity. Now, another thing a lot of people make mistakes doing is they'll just pull a thermostat out. And when you pull a thermostat out, sometimes that water will flow too fast through the system and it doesn't have time to cool through the radiator. If you're going to pull the thermostat out, you need to do one other thing, and that is put a restrictor in so that it controls how fast the coolant goes through that system. On this particular vehicle, that's what I did. I am running a restrictor just because I was having enough problems. I didn't want to wait for a thermostat to open. I wanted it to circulate from where to go. I may change that after I do this. Now, what I'm doing with the foam is I'm going to put this around the expanded metal, and this will expand to 1 inch thick after a day or two. And what that's going to do is it's just going to create a seal where when this fan comes on, it is going to pull all of its air directly from and through the radiator. So I don't have to worry about it not pulling air, or if you don't have a shroud, same thing, it'll pull the air around it instead of pulling it through the radiator. I want all of the air, as much as I absolutely can, coming through the radiator. So, I really like this type of foam. I haven't used it a lot. I use it in construction stuff when I'm doing that. But what I like about it is you can put it in place, create the seal, adjustment here. Once I get it centered real well. There we go. That's what I wanted to see. Now I can trim the edge so it lines up better. That's what I like. Now for the final install on the fan. Again, being real careful not to whack the radiator or knock my nice piece of expanding foam off. Get the radiator set, and you can see it's still pretty tight. It's not a lot of clearance between that winch mount and the back of the fan, and the expanded steel sits really close to that radiator. But it does fit, and it actually fits pretty well. One thing I am going to have to do with this little project is relocate my cab tilt switch, because it was right in the middle of the radiator mount, but I'm going to move it over to the headache rack. Should be a little easier since I won't have to put my arm around the exhaust to raise the cab. The last part of this little cooling system is that nice pretty aluminum panel. Now that I don't have a shroud and I'm trying to control the air with that little double fan, this can go away, and hopefully it can feed air through the tunnel from the grill all the way to the radiator. You can see how the expanded foam, when expanded, sucked right up next to the radiator, creating a seal. I just used a heat gun to speed up that process. Okay, bug number 2, transmission leak, and it's a pretty good one. It's out of the shift shaft seal. Well, I hate leaks, but at least this one's an easy one. The shift shaft seal on the Turbo 400. They aren't that hard to do if you have the cool little puller tool, which I do. So you take off the piece of linkage, get it out of your way. Got this cool little tool here. Thread it in. It'll lock it'll just bite into the seal. Put a little tension on it so it goes, it kind of works like an extractor. So once you get it bit in there and snugged up, then this outer bolt, you tighten it up and it just pulls it. And it usually doesn't take a heck of a lot. And they're out. To get them in, there's another tool. It's basically just looks like a socket with no bite to it or no teeth to it, and then you just tap in the new seal. And there's the old shift shaft seal right there. Make sure it's clean before you put the new one in. All right, installation. This is the seal installer. This is the seal. I always put a little bit of grease in there. Make sure your shaft is clean. You can feel and push this seal over the shaft. Make sure you take care of it so it doesn't tear it. So it looks like we're nice and straight. Set the installer piece in there. You can hear the tone change. That means it's bottomed out. It's in. Only piece left. Put the shift lever on. It's keyed, so all this nut is doing is holding it in place. So you don't have to tighten it to 6,000 pounds. Snug it up, and you're done. That's it. Shift shaft seal replaced. So far, so good on the cooling system. Usually I can let this Jeep run for about 15 minutes in the shop, and it's at operating temperature and that cooling fan's kicked on, and it'll never kick off. Now, at this time, I've let it run probably 30 to 40 minutes before the fan kicked on. That means I'm getting a lot of heat displacement out of that radiator without the fan coming on. And the fan cycled on and back off. Now, it hasn't gotten hot enough yet to really test it on a good hot day in the summer, but we'll keep you posted. As for the transmission leak, so far so good. Thanks for joining. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I do appreciate it. Next, I'm going to introduce the next build, which is the 68 M715. We'll see you next time. We'll talk about the 68 M715 next time, but now let's go four-wheeling, a little hard knocks.